There was a plain manila folder on the table, the kind you could buy from any office supply store for less than $2. In a room full of people who believed they already knew how this story would end, that folder was about to become the only thing that mattered. My brother stood at the front of my father's HVAC shop wearing Dad's old company jacket. The company logo was still stitched over his heart. He smiled confidently at the clients. He thanked the vendors for coming. Then he cleared his throat and made his announcement. From today forward, I'll be running the business. He sounded completely certain, like a man who had spent his entire life believing the world would eventually hand him whatever he wanted. He still hadn't noticed me sitting quietly near the back of the room. 14 years of working beside my father had taught me something. The loudest person in the room isn't always the one holding the power. Then a woman near the entrance slowly raised her hand. Gray blazer, clipboard, professional smile, someone my brother had never seen before. He nodded politely. Yes? She looked directly at him. Then she asked one simple question. Sir, could you explain why every work order issued by this business during the past 2 weeks has been signed under a contractor's license that doesn't belong to you? My brother smiled. Just a small smile. The same dismissive smile he'd given me for years whenever he thought he already knew the answer. He opened his mouth. He managed 3 words. Then, the room held its breath. His eyes drifted down to the badge clipped neatly to her blazer. State Contractor Licensing Board. The confidence disappeared from his face. For the first time that morning, he realized she wasn't asking because she needed information. She was asking because she already knew the truth. His eyes searched the room. He looked toward our mother. She couldn't meet his gaze. He looked at the employees who had worked beside our father for years. Every one of them stared silently at the floor. Finally, he looked at me. I didn't say a word. I reached into my bag, pulled out the plain manila folder. Then I slid it slowly across the table until it stopped right in front of him, just far enough for him to read the label. I'll never forget what happened next. You could actually watch the realization spread across his face. The exact moment a man discovers that the ground beneath his feet was never his to stand on. What happened during the next 10 minutes changed my family forever. But to understand why, we need to go back. 2 weeks earlier, before the funeral, before my brother changed the locks, before my father protected me, without ever telling me he had. Welcome to the Cost of Choice. This is where we tell stories about ordinary people whose lives changed because of one decision. Stories about betrayal, family, greed, loyalty, justice, and the consequences that follow every choice we make. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or forced to watch someone else take credit for everything you worked for, you're in the right place. Before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by someone in your own family? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every one of them. And if stories like this are the kind you enjoy, take a second to subscribe, because every week we bring you another unforgettable story about the choices that change people's lives forever. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because 2 weeks before that meeting, before any of this happened, my father asked me to do one simple thing. At the time, I had no idea that it would end up saving everything he'd spent his entire life building. My name is Sarah. I'm 34 years old. For the last 12 years, I worked beside my father in the HVAC business he built with his own hands. It didn't begin with a fleet of trucks, or a big office, or investors. It started with one used van, one second-hand toolbox, and a man who refused to quit. Dad bought that toolbox from a retiring contractor for $400. He used to joke that it was the best investment he'd ever made. Looking back, I think he was right. Before I tell you anything else, there's something you need to understand about my father. He wasn't the kind of man who said, "I love you." Not often. That just wasn't who he was. He showed love differently. He showed it by teaching me how to read a manifold gauge on a quiet Sunday morning. 3 times, patiently, without a single hint of frustration. He showed it by handing me the keys to my very first solo service call. He smiled, looked me in the eye, and simply said, "You've got this." Then he walked away, before I could see how nervous he really was. When I was 22, I had another life waiting for me. A corporate HVAC engineering company offered me a job, $58,000 a year, benefits, a comfortable office, a predictable future. By every reasonable standard, it was the smarter choice. Instead, I turned it down. I chose $19 an hour, working beside my father. People thought I was crazy. Maybe I was, but something inside me already knew I'd rather build something with him than sit behind a desk building someone else's dream. Dad never asked me to make that sacrifice. I made it because I wanted to, because he needed help, because he was my father. $19 an hour for the first 3 years, no overtime. Dad would laugh and say, "We're family. Family doesn't nickel and dime each other." I'd laugh too, because I believed him, and because, in his own way, he was right. By 24, I'd earned my EPA certification. By 25, I was running my own service calls. By 28, I wasn't just fixing heating and cooling systems anymore. I was doing the bookkeeping too. Dad's handwriting had started to shake. He never asked me to take over. I simply noticed. So I did. That's what you do for people you love. You don't wait to be asked. You just help. 12 years. Nearly 4,000 invoices with my handwriting on them. Thousands of miles on service calls. Thousands of early mornings. Thousands of late evenings. And more cups of coffee than I could ever count. Most of them made for Dad, in the tiny break room at the back of the shop. I'm not telling you this because I want sympathy. I'm telling you because I need you to understand something. That shop wasn't just where I worked. It was where I became the person I am. Every corner held a memory. Every shelf, every toolbox, every workbench. They all carried pieces of my life. So later, when my own brother looked me in the eyes and told me I didn't belong there, you'll understand why those words hurt more than I could ever explain. But there's one memory I return to more than any other. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about 8 months before Dad died. We were replacing a compressor on an old rooftop unit. The July sun was brutal. Both of us were soaked through with sweat. Neither of us said much. We were focused on the work. Then, without looking up from the wiring, Dad quietly said, "You've got better hands for this than your brother ever did." That was it. Just one sentence. Nothing more. He never mentioned it again. I never told anyone he'd said it. Not even Derek. But I carried those words with me every single day after that, because in 12 years, they were the greatest compliment my father had ever given me. And without either of us realizing it, they were also the first sign that he'd already made a decision about who would one day carry his life's work forward. My brother Derek is 3 years older than me. For a while, we worked beside each other in Dad's shop, back when we were both in our 20s. It didn't last. After 2 years, Derek decided he was meant for something bigger. At least, that's what he always said. First, it was a vending machine business. 8 months later, it disappeared. Then, it was a cryptocurrency course. He even convinced our aunt and uncle to invest in it. That didn't last either. After that, he bought a food truck. It never even received its operating permit. Every business ended the same way. According to Derek, it was always bad luck, a dishonest partner, the economy, the timing, anything except Derek himself. I don't think I ever heard him admit he'd made a mistake. Not once. But here's what made Derek dangerous. He was charming, really charming, the kind of person who could walk into Thanksgiving dinner, tell 3 jokes, and have Grandma laughing so hard she'd have to put her fork down. People liked him. People wanted to believe him. Charm has a way of making people ignore patterns they'd notice in anyone else. And Derek knew exactly how to use it. Around strangers, he was generous, funny, confident. Around me, he became someone else. I remember one family dinner, about 2 years before Dad died. Derek had just asked our parents for another loan. This time, it was for what he called a can't-miss real estate deal. Dinner carried on. Nobody wanted an argument. So I asked him quietly, "Whatever happened to the last investment?" He didn't hesitate. He looked straight at me, smiled, then said, "At least I'm trying to build something bigger than fixing people's air conditioners." The table went quiet. Not completely, just enough for everyone to pretend they hadn't heard him. A few uncomfortable laughs. Someone changed the subject, and, like I always did, I laughed too, because keeping the peace had become easier than defending myself. 6 months before Dad passed away, Derek stopped by the shop without calling. I had just finished writing up paperwork after a service call. He leaned against the workbench, watched me for a moment. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind that already knows where it's going. He said, "You know Dad only lets you do all this because it's easier than training somebody else." He wasn't joking. He believed it. He honestly thought 12 years of hard work could be explained away by convenience. At the time, I told myself his opinion didn't matter. But words have a strange way of staying with you, especially when they come from family. Then, a few days before Dad's funeral, our mother told me something I'd never forget. She said Derek had looked at her and shrugged. Then he said, "Dad always said Sarah just liked feeling useful." Feeling useful. I repeated those words in my head for days. 12 years, thousands of service calls, early mornings, late nights, missed holidays, sacrifices. According to Derek, none of it was a career, none of it was loyalty, none of it was love. It was just a hobby, something I did because it made me feel useful. He had no idea how wrong he was. And very soon, the truth would catch up with him. My father died on a Tuesday morning. In March, he was sitting in his favorite recliner. The television was still on. He never got back up. He was 61 years old. My phone rang at 7:14 that morning. It was my mother. Even today, I still remember that number. Not because it mattered, because I've looked at my call history more times than I'd ever like to admit. Some numbers stay with you forever. The funeral was 4 days later, Saturday morning. The church was full. Friends, customers, neighbors, people whose homes my father had kept warm in winter and cool in summer. For more than 30 years, Derek was there. He stood at the front, he gave the eulogy, he cried, real tears, and I believed they were real. Whatever else my brother became, he did love our father. Grief is complicated. People can love someone and still make terrible choices after they're gone. The funeral ended. People gathered in the reception hall, coffee, paper plates, sandwich trays, quiet conversations, memories. Then, Derek cleared his throat, just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He smiled. Then he said, "Well, I guess I'll be running the business now." Nobody answered. Nobody questioned him. It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was an announcement, made before our father's will had even been read. I remember standing there, wondering if I'd imagined what I'd just heard. I hadn't. 48 hours later, the locks on the shop were changed. I found out the hard way. Monday morning, I drove there like I always did, not because anyone expected me to, because some part of me needed to be there. I wanted one more morning inside the building that still smelled like my father. I put my key into the lock, turned it. Nothing. I tried again. Nothing. My key didn't fit anymore. I just stood there, staring at the door. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. Then it buzzed again, and again. One of our oldest clients had forwarded me a text message. Then another client did the same. Every customer had received the exact same message, from a phone number I didn't recognize. It said that all future business should be directed to Derek. I took a screenshot. I still have it, not because I wanted proof, because I couldn't believe what I was reading. 3 days later, I went back. This time, Derek was waiting for me. He stood in the doorway of the shop. Behind him, 2 of our longest-serving employees stood silently. Neither of them knew where to look. I asked one simple question. "Can we talk?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You don't work here anymore." That was it. No explanation, no apology, no conversation. Just 6 words, spoken in the doorway, of the building my father had spent his entire life building. The same building that had taught me everything I knew. The same building where I'd spent 12 years beside him. My own brother looked me in the eyes and told me I didn't belong there anymore. That was the moment everything changed. I didn't argue, I didn't yell, I didn't beg him to change his mind. I simply turned around, walked back to my car, closed the door, and drove away. 2 blocks later, I pulled into the parking lot of a grocery store. I switched off the engine, then I just sat there, both hands wrapped tightly around the steering wheel. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. I wasn't crying. Not yet. I was trying to understand how 12 years of my life could disappear in less than a minute. I wasn't thinking about lawyers, or contracts, or business licenses. I wasn't thinking about winning. I was wondering if I even had the strength to fight. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let Derek have everything, to disappear somewhere quiet and start over. Grief does strange things to people. It makes you question things you would never question on an ordinary day. The first person I called wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't an accountant. It wasn't even my mother. I called my best friend. When she answered, I didn't ask for advice. I only said one sentence. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. She didn't give me a solution. She didn't tell me to fight. She simply reminded me that I wasn't wrong for feeling hurt. Sometimes, that's exactly what a person needs to hear. Later that evening, Mom asked me to help organize Dad's home office. There were stacks of paperwork everywhere. Old invoices, tax records, warranty documents, file boxes. One by one, we worked through them. Then, I found it. A plain manila folder. The same kind you'd walk past without noticing. Inside was a copy of an LLC ownership transfer, signed 4 months before Dad died. Underneath it was another document, a state contractor's license application. Approved, under my name. Mine. I stared at it for several seconds. Then something came back to me. Months earlier, Dad had asked me to sign a few papers. He smiled, handed me a pen, and said, "Just a formality. The accountant needs it for the books." I signed them without asking another question. I trusted him. I never thought about those papers again. Until that night, everything suddenly made sense. I still didn't call Derek. Not that night, not the next morning, not the morning after that. Instead, I called the State Contractor Licensing Board. I gave them the company name. Then I asked one quiet question. Could you tell me who currently holds the active contractor's license for this business? That was all. No accusations, no speeches, no drama, just one question. 4 days later, they called me back. The answer matched every document sitting inside that folder. My father had already made his decision, months before he died, and my brother had absolutely no idea. Have you ever watched someone confidently take credit for something, while you quietly held the truth? If you have, tell me about it in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear your story. And if you're enjoying this journey with me, take a second to subscribe, because what happens next is the moment everything finally catches up with Derek. The next 2 weeks, Derek didn't slow down. If anything, he became even more confident. He booked new residential jobs, signed new customers, sent crews out in the same company trucks Dad had spent years paying for, the same uniforms, the same company name, the same reputation my father had spent more than 30 years building. It was as if nothing had changed, except everything had. One afternoon, Mom told me Derek had asked her to sign some paperwork. He called it temporary operating control. He told her it was only until the estate was sorted out. She signed it, not because she trusted him more than she trusted me, because she was exhausted. Weeks later, she sat across from me in her kitchen. Her coffee had gone cold. She hadn't touched it. She looked down at her hands and quietly said, "Sarah, I just wanted the fighting to stop." She took a long breath, then whispered, "I couldn't lose both of my children in the same year." That sentence has never left me. My mother wasn't the villain. She was a 60-year-old widow trying to survive the hardest weeks of her life. She wasn't thinking like a business owner. She was thinking like a woman who had just buried her husband. A mother, terrified her family was falling apart. Derek knew that, whether he admitted it to himself or not. He used her grief to get what he wanted. Then the stories started spreading. Relatives began calling me. One cousin said, "I heard Derek's planning to sell the company." Another told me, "He said he'll make sure you get whatever's fair." Whatever was fair. I remember hearing those words and quietly laughing to myself. Not because they were funny, because they told me everything I needed to know. He thought 12 years of my life could be reduced to a dollar amount, like loyalty had a price, like sacrifice could be negotiated. He still didn't understand what my father had really left behind. Then, he made the mistake that changed everything. He announced a meeting, a formal introduction, clients, vendors, family, employees. Everyone was invited to meet the new owner. I wasn't invited. A cousin forwarded me the invitation. He assumed I'd already seen it. I hadn't. I read it once, then I read it again. Then, for the first time in days, I smiled. Not because I was happy, because I realized Derek had just handed me exactly what I needed. One public stage, one room full of witnesses, one opportunity for the truth to speak for itself. That afternoon, I made one phone call. No anger, no threats, no drama. I called the State Contractor Licensing Board. I explained that I had documents confirming I was the licensed contractor of record for the business. Then I asked one simple question. Would someone from your office be willing to attend a public meeting where ownership claims are about to be made? There was a brief pause. Then the woman on the other end answered, yes. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and waited. Because for the first time since my father died, I wasn't waiting for justice anymore. I knew it was already on its way. The morning of the meeting, Dad's shop was fuller than I'd seen it in years. Clients, vendors, longtime employees, family. Even my mother was there. She sat quietly near the back of the room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept much. You could see it on her face. At the front of the room, Derek stood wearing Dad's old company jacket. The company logo still rested over his heart. For a moment, I almost forgot whose jacket it had been. He smiled confidently, thanked everyone for coming, spoke about honoring our father's legacy. Then, without hesitation, he started talking about the future, his future. He spoke as though ownership had already been decided, as though the business already belonged to him. Around 90 seconds later, a woman near the entrance slowly raised her hand. Gray blazer, clipboard, professional smile. The same woman I'd spoken to on the phone. Derek nodded politely. Yes? She looked directly at him. Then she asked, Sir, could you explain why every work order issued under this business during the past 2 weeks has been signed under a contractor's license that doesn't belong to you? Derek smiled. The same confident smile. The same smile he'd worn all morning. He laughed quietly, just enough to suggest there had been some misunderstanding. Then she introduced herself. I'm with the State Contractor Licensing Board. The smile disappeared. Immediately. It was as though someone had switched off the confidence he'd been wearing all morning. His eyes locked onto the badge clipped to her blazer. He looked around the room, searching, confused, looking for someone, anyone, to explain what was happening. He looked toward our mother. She couldn't meet his eyes. He looked toward the employees. Every one of them stared silently at the floor. Then, he looked at me. I stood up, slowly. The room watched every step. I walked to the front, placed the manila folder on the table between us. Then, without saying a word, I slid it toward him. Just enough for him to read the label. He opened it. The first document was the LLC ownership transfer, signed by our father, 4 months before he passed away. Underneath it was the document that changed everything. The approved state contractor license, filed months earlier, issued in my name, not Derek's, mine. The room remained completely still. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Every answer was sitting inside that folder. In that moment, I finally understood what my father had done. He'd never wanted his final months to become a battlefield between his children. He never wanted to spend his last days explaining or defending his decision, so he hadn't. Instead, he quietly protected the business, protected the people who depended on it, and protected me. He trusted that one day, when the time was right, the truth would speak for itself. And that day had finally arrived. The representative looked around the room. Then she spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. Every work order issued under this business during the past several weeks, she paused, was performed under the direction of someone who was not the licensed contractor of record. Nobody moved. She continued, that isn't a paperwork issue. It's a regulatory violation, and it carries serious legal and financial consequences. The words landed like concrete, one after another. No shouting, no accusations, just facts. Then, something happened that I never expected. One of our oldest vendors slowly stood up. His name was Frank. He'd worked with my father for nearly 15 years. Frank looked around the room. Then he looked directly at Derek. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I've been calling this shop for years." He paused. "And I was never talking to you." That was all he said. One sentence. No anger, no insults. Just the truth. Somehow, it hit harder than anything I could have said. I looked at Derek. His face changed, little by little. First, confusion, then disbelief, then fear, real fear. He looked around the room, as though someone would step in. Someone would tell everyone there had been a mistake. Nobody did. Then he turned toward our mother. His voice cracked. "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him for just a second, then lowered her eyes. She didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. The room understood something in that moment. The version of Derek everyone laughed with at Thanksgiving was standing beside the version of Derek that had changed locks, redirected clients, and claimed a business that was never his. One man, two very different faces. The silence felt different now. Not tense, certain. People weren't waiting to see what would happen anymore. They already knew. One by one, the clients started picking up their folders. A vendor quietly walked over to me. He reached out his hand, then said, "Your father trusted the right person." I shook his hand. But I couldn't speak, not because I had won, because I wished my father had been there to see it. Derek looked around the room one last time. The confidence he'd walked in with was gone. There was nowhere left to hide. The truth had finally caught up with him, and this time, it had witnesses. Life didn't change overnight. It never does. But little by little, things found their way back to where they belonged. Over the next few months, the State Contractor Licensing Board completed its investigation. Derek was fined. Most of the clients he'd tried to take with him came back. Some called me personally. A few even apologized. One longtime customer said, "I should have asked more questions." I told him not to worry. The truth had already done all the talking. Derek doesn't work in the trade anymore. Last I heard, he'd taken a sales job. Something completely different. We still speak, maybe twice a year. Mostly because our mother asks us to. Some wounds heal, others simply become quieter. The shop is mine now, officially, just as my father intended. The two employees who stood beside him for years never left. Neither did the customers who believed in what he'd built. Last month, I hired our first apprentice. 19 years old, quiet, hardworking, always asking questions. He reminds me of myself when I first walked into this shop all those years ago. Sometimes I catch myself teaching him the same way Dad taught me, patiently, one lesson at a time. Friday became Mom's Day. Every Friday afternoon, she brings lunch for everyone, just like she used to do for Dad. Neither of us has ever said the word sorry. We never needed to. Sometimes, showing up is the apology. Then, a few weeks ago, I finally opened one of Dad's old toolboxes. I'd been avoiding it. Some memories take longer than others. Hidden beneath the top tray, I found a small, folded piece of paper. His handwriting. I recognized it immediately. I unfolded it carefully. It said, "You'll be the one to keep it running." I always knew it. I read it once, then again. I don't know when he wrote it. I don't know if he ever planned for me to find it, or if he simply hoped I would. But that doesn't really matter anymore. The note is taped inside my own toolbox now. Every morning, before I start work, I see it. And every morning, it reminds me that my father didn't leave me a business. He left me his trust. And that's worth more than anything money could ever buy. Looking back, I don't think this story was ever really about a business, or a contractor's license, or even a family inheritance. It was about something much simpler. Respect. Because respect isn't something you're given. It isn't written into a will. It isn't passed from one generation to the next. Respect is earned, quietly. One ordinary day at a time. One early morning. One late night. One promise kept. when nobody else is watching. My father understood that. That's why he never tried to convince anyone that I deserved the business. He didn't need to. He simply made sure that when the time came, the truth would already be waiting. Sometimes, the loudest people in the room seem to be winning. Sometimes, the people doing the real work are completely invisible. But time has a way of revealing what people cannot hide forever. Character always leaves a trail. And eventually, so does the truth. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated simply because you kept showing up, doing the work, without asking for recognition? If you have, I'd really like to hear your story. Leave it in the comments. I read as many as I can. And everyone reminds someone else that they aren't alone. If this story stayed with you, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. Not just for more stories, but because every week we explore the ordinary decisions that change ordinary lives forever. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Until next time, remember this: every choice has a price, and sooner or later, we all have to live with the cost of it.